Hi, my name is Oscar. I'm a software engineer from Bolivia. I live in Germany, and I am the creator of Link Preview.js. Link Preview is a library that allows you to to extract meta information about a URL or a website. So you can think of it whenever you're using WhatsApp, for example, and you paste a link, you get this small preview. It has an image, it has a title, and it has a description. Basically, what the library allows you to do is to have the same functionality in your own application, right? So you just pass a link to it, and it takes care of extracting all the information from the library. Now, I thought it would be cool to do a video about this, just to show you guys how I work or how I maintain the library. If you're new to the open source world, I think it would be cool for you to see how does one take care of the library, how does one contribute, and how does it work. And I'm just gonna go over a small issue. Now, unfortunately, I already recorded this video, but there was some problems with the recording. So I already implemented the functionality and closed the ticket, but I'm just gonna go over it one more time, and hopefully you will be able to tag along and learn a couple of things. Great, so let me just show you my computer. And here you can see this is the library. It's written on TypeScript, so you can run it on JavaScript environment. It's meant to be run on Node.js and on React Native. You could try to run it in just a pure single page application, that means in the browser, but it's not gonna work. It doesn't work like that. You cannot request a different domain from your application. So you need to run this on your server or in your mobile app. So I am just gonna go into the latest issue that one of the users reported. And basically he says that whenever he tries to fetch this specific link, the library never returns. And it causes his server to crash, right? Because it just hangs and it never returns anything. Now, there could be a lot of causes for this. It could be that the URL that he's trying to fetch is just not available, or somehow the server on which this web page resides, it doesn't want to return the response to our library. It could be a bunch of reasons, but it doesn't matter. So basically the problem comes down to how do we handle this type of cases when the server never returns. And right now the library doesn't do anything, right? It just tries to fetch the resource and it just waits until the server responds. There is no timeout built into it. So this is something that we need to add into the library. Now, just a little bit of context as an open source library, right? If I was implementing this on my own, I wouldn't have that much problem because I only have to think for myself, for my own necessities. But since this is an open source library, we need to think a little bit about the use cases, right? So I would assume, or we need to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the developers, that a lot of the developers, whenever they just implement the library, they're not gonna bother setting a timeout or a sensible timeout, right? They're just gonna call it, and if it works, it works. So we need to think, or we need to come up with a number or a sensible default for our timeout, right? We don't want to have a very high timeout, which would cause, again, servers to crash or to just hang. We also don't want to go too low so that some pages, they're just slow. They need to fetch a lot of information and process and render on the server before you get your response. So if you go too low, then we will break a lot of functionality of the web. So we need to go somewhere in the middle. My guess would be anything between 3 to 5 seconds. If your web application takes more than 5 seconds to return, that's a very poor experience, but that's not my problem. You should optimize your website. But I think 3 to 5 seconds should be okay for most websites. So we're just gonna do that. Now, before we start, I need to show you how the library is implemented. So basically, the library, it works via a fetch call. So fetch is an API that allows you to do HTTP requests. So basically that's the main gist of the library, right? The user passes a URL, we try to fetch it, and once we fetch it, we parse the HTML and extract the information, the necessary information from the HTML, right? So basically it's fairly simple. We don't do any black magic. We just take the HTML and extract the information for our users. So one of the problems with fetch is that it doesn't have any built-in timeout, right? You just send a request and then that's it, it's gone. You just need to wait to it. So I did a quick Google research and I came out with this small document. So it just basically says the fetch timeout or the fetch request times out on a default indicated by the browser or by the environment. On Chrome is 300 seconds, which is a long time. On Firefox is 90 seconds, but still quite long. So if we don't do anything, this is when it's gonna time out. So before we get further, we should try to reproduce the issue, right? This should be always the first step whenever you find a bug. So I'm gonna go into my tests for the library. This is what I'm gonna use to verify that the issue is actually happening, right? So the library has some tests that make sure that it does what it's supposed to be doing, right? At least the basic functionality, it should not break whenever I make a change. The test suite should run and notify me if something is failing. So I'm gonna use the test set in order to check for this scenario. So I'm just gonna add a new test here and I'm gonna call it timeout. Right, so whenever I do a request, the library should time out in a sensible time. So in order to do this, I'm just gonna call the library and this is the getLinkPreview function, and for the URL I'm gonna use the URL that the user said is not returning on his server, and I'm gonna save this file, and now I'm just gonna run my test set in watch mode, which means whenever I do any changes to the code, it's gonna try to run all the tests again. So this is gonna be particularly useful for me to quickly iterate and make sure that everything is working. So you can see one of my tests has failed. If I scroll up a little bit, then the timeout test has failed. And it says the async callback was not invoked within the 5000 milliseconds specified by Jest, right? So Jest, by default, it has a timeout. And if any of your tests goes over the timeout, then it just marks it as failed. So we can see that the developer who reported this issue is right. There's something wrong with the link. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't really matter. We should only need to take care of putting some sensible default for a timeout in there. Great. So before moving on, let me just try to think what should happen here. So I'm gonna wrap this call in a try catch block, and so here's what should happen, right? I should try to get the link. It should time out. It should abort the promise, and I should get some information on why was the test aborted. So inside of the try catch, this is gonna run. The error is gonna be catched, and then I need to tell my test what is the expected result. So I expect the message of the error object that I'm gonna receive whenever the promise fails, it's gonna be equal to a request timeout error. So if I run this again, this is still gonna fail, right? Because we're not catching anything. This is just gonna be again telling us that it has timed out because the promise never resolved. So now we need to take care of this. So on the website I showed you before, here's how you add a timeout to the fetch interface. Now basically there's not a straightforward, it's not quite straightforward. You need to use extra class in order to achieve this. So this is what we're looking for, the abort controller. So I'm just gonna go back into the library, and before I do my fetch request, I'm gonna create this controller, right? So I'm just gonna say controller is a new abort controller. Great. And so I need to modify a couple of things. So basically, same as on the test, this is the method that gets called, and you can pass a lot of values into this method, but most importantly there's an options object, right? So if I go into this options object, you can see that we can pass the headers, some other properties, a proxy URL. So basically here we want to add a timeout property, which is going to be of type number. So now that I have a way to pass the timeout in here, I should declare timeout duration, and this is going to come from my options object and the timeout. Now this is the nullish null chaining operator, right? Because you can also call the link preview without any options. So this is basically a safe way to access this property, right? So if the options object is undefined or is null, then this part is never run. This is just returned as null or is undefined. So I won't get any crash to try to access a null reference. And then I have the null checking operator, right? If what's on the left side is null, I still need to have a default value. So I'm just gonna say in this case 3000, which should be 3 seconds. We said this is gonna be enough for most requests. Great, so now that I have my timeout duration and I have my controller, then I need to create my actual timeout, which we do via a normal set timeout call. And I'm gonna pass my timeout duration to it. And inside of this, I call my controller and I say abort. So on my fetch request, I need to pass this into the options. So I'm just gonna move this entire block a little bit up ahead of my fetch options. And I need to pass this as a signal. And this is gonna come from my controller signal, right? So this is effectively gonna cancel my fetch request if the controller signals there's an abortion before it returns. Great, so now what's supposed to happen? Now that we have a timeout, let's say the server responds, right? So nothing went wrong, everything is working as expected. But if you see here, we have a timeout, and one has to be a little bit careful when you set timeouts or intervals, because if you don't clean them, they will still execute, and it might cause some weird behavior. You might have a memory leak, so you always want to clear your timeouts, right? So this is the Goldilocks case. Everything is going fine. I don't need to do anything else. But what happens when the timeout actually occurs, right? So then this call is gonna fail, right? So we should take care of it. Now, there's a couple of ways I can take care of it. I'm just gonna do, I could do via try and a catch, right? But I'm gonna go another way. I'm gonna go with a normal catch in here, just because I think it looks a little bit cleaner. And inside of the catch, what am I supposed to do? So there's one special case I need to take care of. Basically, the library already surfaces a lot of the errors to the user itself, to the developer who implements the library, because maybe he wants to show some feedback to the user. It doesn't matter. That's up to the developer. But the error that we receive from the abort controller is a little bit different. So let me just for now try to do this. I'm just gonna throw the same error. I'm gonna catch it and I'm just gonna throw it. And I'm also gonna log it just for us to see what's in there. And now it's a lot of things are failing, right? And not just the test that I wanted, but pretty much all of my tests are failing. And as it turns out, here I have a reference error. It says the abort controller is not defined, which is weird, right? Here I'm not getting any error from VS Code itself, right? It just says, yes, it's an abort controller. But if you read the description, it says a controller object that allows you to abort one or more DOM requests. So whenever you see a DOM is an abstraction used by the web browsers on web pages. So this already kind of gives me a little bit of a clue, right? That's where I'm thinking, well, if you're talking about DOM, you're thinking about browser terms. But the JavaScript that you run on the browser and the JavaScript that you run on the node environment is a little bit different. So it's more than likely that this abort controller is not available on the node environment. So we need to take care of this. So in order to do this, since I just kind of imported, I need to add it somehow into my project. So I'm just gonna search for controller. And here you can see this is an implementation of the WG abort controller interface. So basically this is a polyfill. This is gonna be, if I add this into my project, I'm gonna be able to use this web browser implementation. So I'm just gonna cancel my test for a little bit and I'm gonna add my abort controller. And on the top of my file, I'm just gonna do import abort controller from abort controller. Great. So I'm just gonna run my tests one more time. And most of my tests are green again, except my timeout test. It has failed in 3 seconds, which is good, which means our timeout is working. But now it says the user aborted a request. So we expected to receive a request timeout, but we're getting something different, right? So we don't want to leave this like this. If we leave it like this and the developers look at this, they will be like, the user aborted the request. That's weird. How did they do it? Did they close the application? So this is just confusing. This is not something that we want to leave as is. So this is why on my catch, this is why I wanted to catch it. I'm just gonna go like this. I'm gonna check for the name of the error and abort. Let me think about this for a little bit. Let me just log the name one more time just to make sure I am doing the correct thing. But let me just say, if the name is equal to abort request, abort error. then I don't want to throw the same error. I want to throw a new error. There's going to be a clean one that's just going to say request timeout. Now if I save it, I'm just going to delete the console log. Great, now my test is passing. Just gonna add one more test with custom time, right? I just want to make sure that one can pass a custom timeout. Let's say 1 second. Great, and here you can see my timeout. The original one, it ends at 3000 milliseconds, and the second one at 1000 milliseconds. So everything's working great. Now I need to publish this library, or these changes I already did, unfortunately, because I'm re-recording this video. But I hope it was interesting for you. I would really like to make more of these videos. Hopefully you learn a little bit more about the implementation of this specific library. But I think I have a lot of knowledge to share. I would really like to see you ask any questions that you might have. I have a lot of experience with JavaScript, React Native, native coding, web development, backend, serverless. I have done pretty much everything. So if you really like it, please leave a comment on the video. And yeah, hope to see you next time.